Welcome back to AE Squared. Once again, here we are in the man cave here at Hiller Measurements, sequestering, sheltering in place, and all that good stuff, just like you probably are at home. Today's a special episode. You're going to really enjoy this one because you're going to meet one of the original folks that really knows how to shelter in place. You'll hear more about that a little later on. Can't wait to introduce you to today's guest. But before we get started, here's an oldie but a goodie about what's still going on here at Hiller Measurements. 5G is coming. More data, more connected things, and capabilities we haven't yet fathomed. But already government and universities, base station, handset, and IoT companies, they have all gone to Hiller Measurements for inspired design in research, development, and production test. Why don't you? Welcome back. So today is a unique opportunity. Truth be told, when I was a child, if you ask me what I wanted to be, and my parents will tell you this to this day, my passion was to be an astronaut. My hero as a child was John Glenn. And it's funny how life works out. Never ended up becoming an astronaut. But today I have the privilege to have an astronaut for a friend, and I'm going to introduce you to him today. So today you're going to get a chance to meet Colonel Greg Johnson. Colonel Greg and I met on an airplane a little while back, got along swimmingly well. I've gotten the chance to learn more about Greg. I've gotten a chance to be mentored by Greg. You'll hear later on how Greg and I have a future together. But today, we're going to spend some time getting to know Greg and his past and have a good discussion about how to manage stress, mitigate risk, and what it's like to be all alone, because I'm sure a lot of people can relate today. How are you, Greg?
Great. How are you doing, Jeff?
It's good, buddy. I'm doing well. It's great to have you. Originally, for our guests, Colonel Greg was scheduled to come and do the show live on our soundstage, but COVID had its own ideas, so here we are. So, Greg, it's been a few months since sitting in first class on United together. I don't know about you, but I'm itching to get on an airplane again.
I think that was my last flight, Jeff. I really do. It was one of the last ones.
Well,
I do remember, though, you made a comment about my scotch.
That's true.
And then I had a quick comeback, and we won't go into the details.
We'll save that one for the sequel, and you've got to come to Hiller and hear it for yourself. So
yeah,
that was
exactly.
That was a fun night, though. That was a fun night. So
it really was.
So let's go back and so that I can sit here and think about how your path took you straight towards being an astronaut and where I went astray. So let's talk about share with our audience a little bit about where you grew up and how you where you first got the bug to fly and how that led to the Endeavour.
Well, I was a military brat. Okay,
Yeah.
So my father was a musician in the Air Force, but of course, musicians in the Air Force go to the big major commands. And so I spent my childhood traveling around the world. I was born in the UK. We went to Germany, New Jersey, ended up at Wright-Patterson in Ohio. And so during that time, there was always airplanes flying around. So I was in an environment to get excited about airplanes.
Yeah.
Probably one of the big moments that kind of, planted the seed for that dream happened when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. It was July 20th, 1969. We were getting ready to go to Germany, actually from the States that summer. And I was up at my grandparents' house. Mom and Dad woke us up after our bedtime so we could watch that momentous moment. I was sitting next to my brother and sister, Mom and Dad, and both grandparents.
Yeah.
And I just could not believe that a person was actually walking on the surface of the moon.
Yeah.
I was inspired, Jeff.
Yeah.
And then I went outside, I looked at the moon, and I could not believe that a person was actually stepping on the surface.
Your brain stretched at the thought. Yeah.
And, and the funny thing is, I didn't think it was very likely, but it was a dream. I didn't say no to that dream, which is what I tell kids.
Yeah.
Don't say no to things because that'll never happen.
Yeah, right.
I just said, hey, I'd like it to happen. My brother and sister scoffed at me a little bit, but the seed was planted. And then there were several events that happened through the course of my life. Maybe all the way up to the early 90s when I came back from Desert Storm. I was a fighter pilot by that time, and I can fill that in between if you like.
Sure.
But I was a fighter pilot, and I met the future NASA administrator. He had just flown one flight in the shuttle, Charlie Bolden.
Oh, yeah.
And with great interest, I went to one of his town hall meetings about the time when the space station was going to get killed, and it actually passed by one vote.
Yep.
And I went to that meeting because I thought, wow, he's actually coming pretty close to town. It was in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. And I said, hey, I'm going to watch and hear what the man says about space. And I listened with great interest. And afterwards, I patiently waited to talk to him. And he said, you're a fighter pilot. You went to the academy and got some technical degrees. Why don't you go be a test pilot? That's the next step for a guy like you. That's what I did. He was a Marine and he went to Pax River. I went to Edwards. But the man was right. And I worked super hard at Edwards and eventually got selected to be in the astronaut corps.
Wow. So you went in the astronaut corps. What year was that?
1998.
1998. So before that, you're at Edwards. You first of all, it's notable that he said you should go be a test pilot, and you went. That in and of itself is not a sure thing either. It's not like you just get to choose on your own and get to go. That's the best of the best get the chance to go to Edwards.
Well, that's true. I would say that as you know, during my journey to get to the astronaut corps, there was a pretty good cut going to the Air Force Academy, right? That was pretty challenging.
Right.
Then going to grad school, that was another chance to excel. Pilot training, you got to do well enough to fly a fighter, and then getting a fighter is a challenge. So there were a lot of wickets along the way, and the pool shrinks.
Yeah.
But going into the astronaut corps in 1998, we only had 3,000 people competing for 24 slots.
Oh,
this past class, they had 18,000 competing for 16 slots. So I would never get selected now. There's no way.
We won't go there then. Let's just.
No, I'm just kidding you.
Just take. So I would imagine in your time at Edwards, though, you probably had a chance to get some stick time on some fairly interesting planes while you were there.
100%. And we were qualified in a lot of different airplanes.
Right.
They were all my airplanes were all variations of the T-38, which is a trainer, but they make an attack version.
Yep.
And then all versions of the F-15, including the ones that we export to the different countries, F-15S, F-15J, you can guess the countries.
Yep.
But probably the most interesting airplane I flew was the NF-15B active. And we had the F-35 thrust vectoring system, the original one that we were testing, where they integrated the thrust vectoring and the flight control system. It's a red, white, and blue F-15 with canards. It's one of a kind asset.
Right.
And since I was a Strike Eagle pilot, I was like the only test pilot who had flown in that suite of software and displays, the glass cockpit that we had in the F-15E. So it was good timing, but I took advantage of it. And that was a really rewarding test program where we had a lot of first flight milestones along the way and could build some street cred flying airplanes. So it was a lot of fun.
While you're at Edwards and you're a test pilot, test being the operative word, that is not the place for Tom Cruise Top Gun type behavior. That's the stone cold engineering mindset, is it not? For those in the cockpit,
it generally is, and it's supposed to be. Right. I wouldn't say that we didn't light our hair on fire a few times.
Sure,
but when you're in a situation, I mean, I remember the first supersonic flight of active.
Yep.
And I was the pilot on that flight. That was one of my little milestone moments. We got the AB burn through voice. AB burn through, right. AB burn through, right. Oh. That's not when you're very happy.
Oh.
Okay, you're going supersonic.
Yes.
And the afterburner is reporting a burn through.
That's
okay. So huge. So that it's just huge focus, talking to the control room, because we always had control rooms for those kind of test missions. And then I quickly found out that they'd been monitoring that temperature in the AB compartment for quite some time. they hadn't told me that it was rising and approaching the limit, but it was an expected result. It would have been nicer had I known that was coming. But in any case, I just executed the procedure and we slowed down, came back safely.
So let's talk about that for a second, because here, for most of our viewers, many of our viewers are technically oriented in their career, but not all are. But everyone universally today in this time of COVID is struggling with fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the availability of good and bad data alike, and not having a really good, clear idea of how to tell the difference between both of them. And then in the midst of all of that, we've got the political winds that create hyperbole, and you wonder what you're not being told as much as how you were being told. And I see that for our viewers, the experience that we all are going through right now does have a slight metaphor to your experience while you were at Edwards. I'm curious, talk to us a little bit about what risk management for you personally, since it's your rear end in the cockpit, what that looked like for you, being that you're flying, but there's an ocean of engineers that may or may not be telling you everything that they know or are in search of, and how you manage your emotions and the induced stress of all of that so that you can still execute.
Well, I think it's important, for one, when you have a crisis situation, that you don't panic. You keep your cool. And throughout my career, I had a bunch of opportunities to kind of fine tune that skill, whether it be as a test pilot, going to combat in the F-15, or launching on the space shuttle, for that matter.
Right.
Or even some of the jobs I had afterwards when I was ambushed at Capitol Hill. I mean, you just keep your cool,
right?
Because if you waste too much energy stressing out over it, then you're not going to have the energy to get yourself through the crisis.
Is that a learned skill, or is that a natural skill?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I think, when I first was, encountered a challenging situation, I probably could have done better. I remember Desert Storm when I was a young captain in the Air Force. There were times where I would look at myself, go, wow, I could have done a better job here, there, or the other. But when you get those situations where it feels familiar.
Yeah.
When I first launched in the space shuttle, it felt very familiar to the feelings I had before my first combat mission. And so those same triggers and those same processes to deal with the situation came to light. And it's like, oh, this is that situation. You want to compartmentalize your thinking. You want to follow the serenity prayer, which, you got to focus on the things you can influence. And if you can't influence them, just take them out of your mind.
Right.
And then also, and this is something that you and I maybe haven't talked about, is the notion of focusing on the single most important element of your problem, whatever it is. Now, I got that advice from Neil Armstrong himself, and Dean Armstrong, his brother, and we had lunch last summer at the 50th anniversary at his Boytown home, and we talked about it again. Dean Armstrong has used that his entire life, from what his big brother had suggested when he was in high school.
So say that again. It sounds like more of a focus on a myopic view of the one thing you can change. Is that?
Well, okay, myopic may not be the right term, because you want to keep situational awareness.
Right.
But I'd say it's more about focusing on the one problem that you can solve, and not getting caught up in going down a rabbit hole with some of those secondary things that are all connected to this central thing.
Right.
And what I found is, following that advice in a tough situation, is when you attack with focus on the center of gravity of a problem, all the secondary pieces will be weakened and will follow.
Right.
And so it's a good way to think about, when you're in a crisis, what's the most important thing? Not what's the third most important thing, or the fifth, but one thing.
Or not trying to focus on boiling the ocean and solving all things.
Roger. But it's also important, I think, especially when you're in a team environment, to not be too hasty.
Right. To
actually inventory the skills of the situation, if possible, and get at least some contrarian or opposing inputs that might help you find even a better solution than what you could produce yourself.
Right.
I've worked with really smart people over my career in the Air Force and with NASA, and then out of NASA.
Right.
And the very smartest folks that also listen to the team are the ones that come up with the best solutions. If they just go it alone, and ignore all the smart people around them, they might get it right 90% of the time, but they're never going to approach 100% until they use the skills of the entire team.
So when you were in a test pilot as well as an astronaut, where is there room for creative thinking, or is it train, 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 stick to the plan? Because
So
that ties into this, what you're saying here.
So the answer to that is yes.
Mm-hmm.
You asked me an or question. My favorite answer to that is yes.
Of course.
You absolutely need to stick to the plan,
right,
if the scenario calls for it.
Right.
Because if you deviate from the plan significantly, then you're going to lose other members of the team. Right. But that being said, every problem has some elements of being unique to other problems. They're never cookbook.
Right.
And so you have to be thinking, you have to be questioning, and you have to be creative. And so I think it's a mixture of both. It's relying on the reactions and the training algorithms that you've experienced during your training, but also being open to ideas and creativity that could lead you to even a better path.
So you got to experience that. I'd like to get into a little bit here. Now, let's take it. Now you're in the astronaut corps. And a lot of, when you were in training, some interesting events happened and some that were tragic, obviously, speaking of Columbia. But it seems that in that time when you were in the Corps, there was a number of opportunities for creative on-the-spot thinking, it seems, whether that be dealing with opening hatches on the Hubble to do the repair, we were talking, maybe you can speak a little bit about some of your colleagues and the solar panel challenges and whatnot. That's where I'm really kind of leading into that is now that you're commanding a multi-billion-dollar tool, the shuttle, and you've got the world's media attend. It's a shall we say it takes some gravitas to decide to go from autopilot to to manual flying at times. Can you share a little bit with our viewers some of the lessons learned, or that opportunity for the right time for creative on-the-spot critical thinking while on orbit?
So, the one that really comes to mind was not one of the flights that I was on.
Mm-hmm.
It was STS-120.
120, okay.
And on that flight, I think STS-120 is probably the closest analogy to what happened on Apollo 13, where they really had to think outside of the box to try to innovate very quickly and solve the problem. And what happened on that flight, they were taking up, I believe, the third of ultimately four solar arrays to be installed on the International Space Station. Right. And they robotically attached the piece of truss that has the solar array in it. And then, the first two were cookbook. They happened just as planned. Mm-hmm. And so they were unfurling it for the third time in space. But the unfurling was abnormal, because a wire caught it and clipped the solar array and damaged it on the way out. They had to actually stop after they, it wasn't even midway to deal with the situation, because it was going to tear the thing apart. So then it was a point of take the time to innovate. So we huddled on the ground. They huddled up there. They came up with a great solution. They created little cufflink Band-Aids for the solar array. It was on TV.
Sure. And
with the materials that they had on board.
Right.
Now they've got a 3D printer up there, so they could have easily
That's fantastic.
Made a fancy, they didn't have a 3D printer at the time, so they used the stuff they had, and then they pulled together as a team, came up with a plan, and executed the spacewalk. Scott Parazynski, he's one of the more notable astronauts. He summited Mount Everest, I believe, or at least went to the top camp. Mm-hmm. And he's a real explorer kind of guy. Yeah. Medical doctor, Renaissance man.
Yeah.
And he went out with my buddy Wheels for this really, famous spacewalk.
Right.
And he was out on the tip of the robotic arm as far as it would reach, using this hockey stick that they had created out of Kapton tape to because the solar arrays, nobody wants to get shocked out there.
Yeah.
And this stuff had never been done. And so Scott basically was, helping to guide the solar array while Wheels was manually kind of feeding the line to extend this thing out to full deployment. So it was an amazing, execution that they came up with. And when I went up there a couple flights later, you could clearly see the cufflinks, and it looked pretty much like a normal solar array. I mean, that's great.
Fantastic.
That's human ingenuity at its finest. The Apollo 13 scenario. With me, I had a couple crises. We trained and trained and trained. It was almost 10 years from when I was selected to be an astronaut till I actually got my first flight for a lot of different reasons.
Right.
And so, we did have an accident in between there that I think we might talk about later. But my first liftoff, I didn't expect to see the master alarm 7 seconds after liftoff. I mean, the launch itself is so crazy, it's sensory overload, light, sound, vibration. It was a night launch. So we had an overcast deck and the light illuminated the Florida coast. And it just leaped off the ground. You just can't simulate that in training.
Right.
But 7 seconds after liftoff, we got that master alarm, and it was a major malfunction. We lost 6 of our 44 reaction control system jets. Now,
Really?
at the time, those little jets aren't as important as obviously the main engines and the solid rocket boosters.
At that time, but reentry is a different subject, isn't it?
Right. Well, actually, just coming off the external tank, you use those jets. And so we had a very abnormal ET-SEP, as they call it, external tank separation. But again, I think one of the challenges we had in that scenario is none of us had seen that exact malfunction, but we had an idea of what it was.
Right.
Astronauts say this a lot, but the pilot is always one switch throw from making a bad situation worse.
Right.
So, you kind of analyze your situation, and if you don't have to do something, you don't do it. And we didn't do anything until we got up to orbit.
Well, and with the SRBs, it's not like you can do much at that point anyway, right? I mean, solid rocket boosters, you have to wait till it's like Dancing with a Gorilla. You're not done till they're done, right?
Well, that's true. But we could distract ourselves, and maybe this is related to focusing on the central issue.
Right.
This malfunction didn't rise to the level where we had to do something about it until we got main engine cut off about 8.5 minutes after liftoff.
Right.
So, but at that time, once we were on the tanks and external tank separation had not occurred, it would have been good to have a communication about the malfunction.
Right.
Because then we wouldn't have been so surprised by the external tank release.
So
it was very asymmetric.
By the time you got to MECO, had you and ground come up with really what the strategy was going to be, or were you guys still watching and waiting?
The latter, which is by design, because they all knew what had happened. They were pretty certain what had happened. They've got all those engineers and background people that are experts on the systems, so they knew it was going to be okay. But when you're on the pointy end and you're in a vehicle that's not performing the way you would expect it, it would be nice to have had a little bit of a discussion before it happened. But it was fine. It turned out fine, and it didn't really matter. We were just a little bit in the dark until, no pun intended, until that came off the tank, and it was very abnormal. And I remember we're looking over at the commander who had flown 2 shuttle flights prior, actually 3, and I said, "Was that normal?" And he says, "No, that wasn't normal."
Yeah. So I'm
but
curious.
Then we figured it out.
Yeah.
We reconfigured the vehicle, went to redundant systems for those jets. We got them all back.
So between flights 1 and 2, you come back on the ground. How involved or how interested were you in tracking root cause and what the fix was, so that you didn't have that same master alarm again? Or once you landed, was it just pretty much, "Thank you, talk to you later, I'm going to go hit the bar"?
Well, it's probably a little bit of both. Again, we have debriefs. It's what's really good about the shuttle program, is that we had a very strong level of planning and training.
Right.
and we were very deliberate about our execution, and we used what we call space flight resource management. It's similar to CRM, crew resource management in airplanes. And then we always had debriefs.
Yeah.
And so we always learned as much as we could, time allowing, to make the next situation better. So I think every time we have these learning experiences, we grow and innovate. And I think that's how you become better in these type of situations. I ended up being a safety guy, so I got to play around with a lot of those hazards that we had on the space shuttle and the space station, and understand the trades between the level of risk and the probability of that risk for many of the major systems on the shuttle and the space station.
So let's rewind a little bit, because before that first flight was a tragic time for our country, but probably uniquely for you. Do you take us back? Where were you when you found out that Columbia had not survived? Tell me about that day.
It's one of those, on one hand, you can count the moments where you knew exactly where you were on that moment.
Like a 9/11 moment. Yeah.
Yeah, this was for me. So the kids were young. I'd say maybe 4, 5, and 8 years old, something like that. 4, 6, and 8, something. But stair-step kids lined up on the couch in the living room. Saturday mornings, I usually made daddy eggs. So I was cooking breakfast. And the entertainment of the morning was to watch STS-107 come in for landing. So we had the NASA channel up, and the kids had their orange juice, and I was making their eggs, and it turned out to be a terrible situation. So right in front of the kids and my wife, we watched the disintegration of Columbia. And so myself, just like all my associates in the astronaut corps, there was no recall. Everybody just went to work. I said, Carrie, I'm out of here. I'm gonna get dressed. I'm going to work. And we all show up at work, and said, okay, what can we do? And so we broke up into teams very quickly. And by Monday, we were all on different teams. We had a rescue team that went north and picked up different debris up north of Houston, Humble, and Nacogdoches area. I was assigned to a team, and we basically divided and conquered to try to get to the bottom of it as soon as possible. So,
and you ended up playing a more, even after the recovery effort, you continued to be involved as far as the root cause testing and analysis and investigating the foam.
Yeah, so we all did. We all played part in it. I ended up on a team that kind of analyzed the decision-making process, because we saw that foam hit the wing on ascent. We knew that we had film. And so I was on a team to assess, it was a little bit of a black hat team to kind of decide, okay, did we make a mistake? And, so how do we figure not to make that same mistake again? And it did have parallels to the Challenger accident with the O-rings. I mean, it had some similarities. And what's interesting is our 2 shuttle flights, a lot of the errors that were made were in the managers, and we've already talked about that, not listening to the people who have the answers below them, but that's a lesson that's going to happen, because it's very difficult, because for every person that has the right answer down there, there's also probably several that don't have the right answer. And it's a real challenge for managers to get listen to the right ideas.
One.
That's not easy.
They all sound plausible.
And so, not throwing rocks at anybody, but we did find in both cases that there was a right answer, a correct answer to each one of those scenarios. In any case, we kind of looked at that, and then we started looking at, okay, what damage could have happened had we had the right decision-making process and the right tools in place to understand what happened. And we were originally thinking it was the tile. We weren't thinking about the leading edge, the reinforced carbon-carbon. And so then we, bifurcated that team, and one group of the team went off to look at, is it plausible that foam could actually impact the leading edge? So that was a pretty small group. We had 3 or 4 of us on that team. And we eventually went to the Southwest Research Institute in San Antonio, and firsthand witnessed that fateful day where, and everybody in the country saw it, where it just made a huge hole in the reinforced carbon-carbon. So it was sort of the smoking gun, and that also helped the reconstruction team better understand the debris. And then we pretty much knew what happened by the end of that 2-year time frame. So a long answer, but it was a very interesting, challenging, and also heart-wrenching period in most astronauts' lives in that time.
I got to say, not to blow sunshine up a spacesuit here, but one of the things that I've always found very humbling talking to you was recognizing that while that had all been going down, you were not on the rotation for a flight, but it wasn't long afterwards when you were put on a flight roster. And I've always been curious, having gone through that gut-wrenching experience, having a family, a young family going through it, and then being asked to do what you'd always wanted to do since you were a child, to fly Endeavour. Again, how difficult was that inside your head, the voices in your head, so to speak? And what was that conversation like with your family as you planned to say yes to go fly Endeavour after everything you all had gone through?
Well, it was easy for me because I was like right in the middle of all the discussions. And it wasn't just the thermal protection system. We went back and looked at the solid rocket boosters. We looked at the main engines. We looked at every system on the space shuttle.
Right.
And so I felt 100% sure that was the safest space shuttle that was ever going to fly.
Right.
Were the ones after the accident.
Right.
So I was comfortable with that. And also, it's dangerous to drive in Houston, right? And Austin, in your case. There's an accepted risk that we say, hey, that's a risk, but I'm willing to accept it. Some people will skydive, others won't, because they just won't accept that risk.
Right.
And so before I got my foot into a jet and pilot training, before I got into a combat fighter, and before I went to the space shuttle, there was no doubt in my military mind that it was as safe as it was going to be, and I absolutely was going to accept the risk.
Right.
So I was comfortable.
Right.
As far as my kids and my wife, they didn't have the advantage of having that information that I had. So I did feed it to them on a continual basis because I knew it was coming. Right. Eventually, I was going to have that first space flight, and it was 2008 by the time I had it. So we had a little bit of time during the return to flight period to my flight, where I was kind of tailoring the landscape. I was and bringing the kids into, hey, this is what we talked about today. We talked about the return to launch site abort, which is now going to be better as a result of our conversations. And we talked about this system. All the systems of the space shuttle are going to be, we can repair the tile and the reinforced carbon. At least we have a plan to repair it.
Right.
Yeah. And we're going to do this inspection.
Pirouette inspection.
Yeah, exactly. And that was just part of the inspections. We spent flight day 2, we spent 8 hours inspecting our tiles. And so we could see underneath the vehicle and all the different parts of the vehicle. Yeah. So we had a very good protocol to make sure that we were safe. And we also looked at ourselves before we came back as well. So.
Right. One of the things, though, it comes back to that acceptable level of risk, right? Because in flight 1, then you have a master alarm. Flight 2, and in post-production, we don't have it while we're speaking live, but our viewers, hopefully right now, you're watching this. After your and I's fateful flight, I got to the hotel that night, and I immediately went to YouTube and started being a stalker of Colonel Greg. And one of the first videos I saw, I was watching, and it's this video we're playing right here, of you on station inspecting what turns out to be a damaged tile on Endeavour.
Right.
After everything you've been through. And I've always been wondering, right there when you first looked at that, what was going through your head there? Was it, oh, crap, or was it no problem?
It was no problem.
It was no problem.
But that was partly because when we were going through the drill of understanding damage to tiles on flights prior to STS-107,
right,
we looked at the records of all of those flights. And there were several flights. I think STS-66 was the worst, but maybe the number is wrong, but that had thousands of pockmarks underneath it.
Right.
And it became almost a culture where, hey, we expect damage to the tile, no big deal. It still comes back just fine. In this case, in 107, it turned out to be the reinforced carbon-carbon, which they really didn't think foam could damage. But in any case, I was comfortable with the damage because I knew we had that kind of damage on a lot of shuttles prior. But that being said, we did have enough damage to trigger what's called the focused inspection, where you spend another robotic section analyzing that small area.
Right.
And we had a couple of those that we looked at very closely, and then they do a lot higher fidelity analysis on those areas, and all the engineers said it was fine. What wasn't something that I really expected regarding damage was we got impacted by a micrometeoroid on my first
Yes,
flight.
we have a picture of this. Yes.
Yes.
So talk to us about that.
And so it luckily crashed into the commander's window, not the pilot's. I'm just joking. He'd live like, a
few milliseconds longer. Yeah.
But in any case, we had 4 rookies on that flight, and none of us had seen that kind of damage. And so once again, crisis management, keep your cool. We kept our cool, but you could tell that the rookies were a little more stressed than the veterans. The veterans said, that's fine.
That sounded like a shotgun going off when it hit?
Well, no, we didn't even hear it.
Really?
We just noticed it because it was a pretty big pockmark on the window. You can see on that photo. But we took photos of it, lots of photos and video, and sent it down, and the engineers said it was fine. The only mistake I made on that particular situation is I failed to tell my wife before she heard about it on the news. And I was in the doghouse for that one.
Oh,
so I'll just tell you
well,
so
yeah, but your doghouse
is
what, 220 miles up? So,
well,
yeah.
It always comes back to communication. Honestly, I mean, when we look at ourselves and we learn, communication is often the problem. It's not what we do; it's how we don't communicate.
So even on orbit, marital communication is a design parameter everyone needs to think about. Is that the
yes.
the lesson?
We all have a pecking order.
I love it.
It's with my daughter. I have a funny story. My daughter and I were spending a really rich time together, and I was having to sign these autographs for the photos for NASA. That's one of the things we get to do.
Right.
I had this big stack of them. She was helping me. She was flipping them,
Right.
And so I took a break and I came back to her, and she had presented me with a photo where she had put in hair and freckles, and then she said, "Dear Daddy, reach for the stars. Love, Rachel." It's like, and I cherish that photo.
That's a prized possession.
Because I was her dad first, and I was an astronaut second.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So there she's grounding me a little bit, which is cool. And I love her. She's super smart. She still to this day calls me out on things.
Yeah,
I say to her, just the other day I said something about the pandemic, and she said, "No, it's not quite like that, Dad." But she's super smart. She's going to medical school, so I got to
be so proud.
Yeah, I'm very proud.
So, Greg, after being an astronaut, talk to us about what life was like immediately thereafter.
Yes. So a lot of astronauts go through a kind of a period after they leave the astronaut corps that they miss those exciting days, maybe the camaraderie. Their new situation is very different. With me, it was just the opposite, because I was planning on staying at NASA, and this new initiative came up, and I initially said, "Hey, no, I want to go for a third space flight." And eventually, the mission called me off the astronaut corps, is essentially what it was, because I viewed it as so important. I got to go do this, and it met all the criteria that I have: is exciting, has an impact, always learning, and I was going to learn a lot over the subsequent months. And so I went into this thing as just the next challenge.
And what was this thing?
Okay, this thing was a nonprofit that was commissioned to develop half of the science and technology on the space station differently than what NASA had done previously. Our focus was on Earth benefit, not for exploration.
Right.
And it was to bring in commercial innovation, non-traditional users to put on the space station for Earth benefit. So that included, biotech companies. Pretty much, it was a white sheet of paper on the kind of things that we could invite to the International Space Station. It was very controversial. I felt like I was in the battleground the entire time, but we made sense of it, and we built a really fine team over that 4.5-year period. It was exhausting. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, right.
But I learned so much about, the interfaces of a nonprofit and a government organization, and the political interfaces, and then having a board of directors above us. Yeah. Very high level board members that we had on this. And so it was a great leadership challenge for me. And I think, although I probably aged a five extra years doing it, I think I learned a whole lot. And so that's why these last 2 years I've been freelancing and doing, having fingers in lots of different pies. And I've enjoyed this as well. But I have to say that was one of the great, segments of my life. A lot of learning and coordinating during that period of time with cases.
Are you getting a chance to fly?
Well, that was one of my promises to myself when I left the National Lab, is to learn how to fly. So I started in the seaplane, the float plane, single engine Piper Cub. And about just a few months ago, I went up and got my full up airline transport pilot. And so I wasn't planning on joining the airlines, but I wanted to do freelance flying in maybe a little fighter outfit in Florida. I ended up checking out in the Learjet, and I'm a co-pilot for a group there, and maybe some others. So, but the flying thing kind of came to a halt when COVID hit. So we're going to see what the future brings. Probably my flying will be more filled with things I'm doing with Hiller.
We might as well let the cat out of the bag then. So, especially since we have taken our time, and I know your bride's waiting for you. So my apologies to your wife. But I do want to announce to our audience today, not only we're really excited to bring Colonel Greg to AE Squared, but Colonel Greg is going to let us bring him to Hiller. So, Colonel, welcome aboard. Greg is the founding member of Hiller Measurement's new Board of Technical Advisors. Could not be more excited to tell you that. Greg's going to be heading up our strategies for how we can expand the value we bring, both to the warfighter on the ground and in the air, but also our portfolio, which we already have one, of how we can provide test resources and talent for expanding into space, whether that be for manned or unmanned missions. So, Greg, we are so honored and humbled to have you on our team.
I'm really excited, Jeff. Thank you.
You're going to see a lot from Greg. And the best thing for you all at home, you're not going to have to look at me all the time, because Greg is going to host his own series at least once every 3 months or so that are an opportunity for Greg to take us all along to meet some of the people he's met along his way, as well as explore some passions he has, including broadening the reach and the excitement of the STEM fields to the youth in America. And we're so excited to support you in that endeavor as well.
And that's a very important one.
I couldn't agree with you more. As a guy who's hiring a lot of engineers right now, I absolutely agree.
You need talent.
Absolutely.
It's out there.
More and more of it every day.
Yep.
Greg, welcome aboard. For you guys at home, thanks for joining us this week. Next week, to be honest with you, I don't know who's up next. This is the end of this 3 rotation. Just like you, we're making this up as we go. But I promise you this, you're going to want to check out the next episode at AE Squared, because actually I do know who's coming. You know who's coming on board on the next one? We have got an instructor pilot straight from Luke Air Force Base, and that is Justin Hazard Lee. Flies the F-35. Not only does he fly the F-35, he's got his own podcast called The Professional's Playbook. You're going to love hearing from Justin, just like we love having Greg on board. So check us out in 2 weeks, and then I'll go find some new talent for our next episode. So thanks for listening this week. We'll talk to you soon right here on AE Squared. AE Squared is a Hiller Measurements Town Hall production. Copyright 2020. The email address, if you'd like to attend a future taping, is tickets@hillermej.com. Hey friends, this is Jeff from AE Squared. When I was a kid, I dreamt of being a fighter pilot. It's funny how life turns out. Although I never became one, today Hiller Measurements takes enormous pride in supporting our nation's warfighters, especially those who fly and fight. So you can imagine my excitement to have Justin, call sign Hazard Lee, who flies the F-35A Joint Strike Fighter on AE Squared. Justin takes us both into the seat of our nation's preeminent fighter and into the mind of today's fighting force. Surprisingly, we also discuss how Justin himself has built a following with his own podcast, The Professional's Playbook, which you will absolutely love. So join me, Fanboy Jeff, and get to know one of our nation's finest, Justin Hazard Lee, right here on AE Squared from Hiller Measurements.